About halfway through a movie I had just seen, I put my arms behind my head and skimmed the credits. I got up from the couch, went to the kitchen, stretched my arms overhead, opened the refrigerator door, and discovered a full carton of juice. So I took a seat at the window, facing kitchen counter, opened the lid, and I took several long, loud gulps. And when I was done drinking, I gasped to breathe. It was 9:15 p.m., and I wiped my mouth on the back of my hand. My evenings were uneventful at this time of year in the summer. One of my parents had gone to see my aunt and uncle, who lived by the wayside, on a Saturday in July when school was out for the holidays. Coast, they wouldn't be returning for another 2 weeks, so I turned down their invitation. We frequently stayed there, so I didn't mind the location or my family. Long that I would miss the majority of summer vacation, and to be honest, I would much prefer spend it in town with my pals. I was a good kid who they allowed me to stay at the house as long as I was able to wash clothes, use an oven, and generally not be a fool. It was tidy, and as I sat there, I peered out into the garden to see if there was anything spooky there. I kind of wished we had a dog cat as a pet, because the dark was empty and dismal. Would be pleasant right now, but I constantly sneezed and got hot and irritated eyes from their hair. Even though I wouldn't mind, my dad refused at 9:3222 p.m. with that in mind. I returned to the window and hoisted myself onto the refrigerator door after placing the remaining juice cartoon there. To make sure everything was in its proper place, I looked out to the garden once again and identified each shadow individually, where 2 little trees stood together near the back fence and a metal table with 4 chairs, and the shrubs were in their typical shape. Chairs relaxed on the patio. I enjoy looking at these things, which is mostly I despised sleeping. Therefore, I would constantly get up to look into little noises throughout the night, which is why I wasn't afraid of the dark. Putting my back to the wall, I would prefer to be aware of anyone in my room at night, so that at least there was the slimmest possibility of escaping in some way meant that my concerns were I was promptly put to sleep since I either opened my eyes or accept there's nothing downstairs, the radiator exploding with heat. To find a bedroom unoccupied and be unsure of the source of the strange sounds emanating from the kitchen, the stairs, or in my skin creeps about 9:30 p.m. because of my room. I stepped away from the worktop and chose to finish the juice after wandering back into the living room to switch off the TV. I returned to the kitchen upstairs, opened the refrigerator door, and paused. I closed the refrigerator door and switched off the lights after turning my head to look outside and noticing that someone was standing in the yard. Light to make it harder for them to see me, and they walked slowly to lean on the kitchen counter to get a better view of everything. I paused to remind myself that all of the neighbors were home and that the doors were shut. Even yet, as I stood there trying to glimpse his or her, my heart began to race a little. Shape in the darkness near the garden's end, I had to constantly turning my head away to make their hazy outline visible in my eyesight. They appeared somewhat slim and were standing motionless, but that's all I could see, but I was unable to identify anything else. Oh, I exclaimed out loud that it was the garden. I had forgotten that we used the umbrella that was sitting against the back fence for afterward. I grinned to myself, happy that I hadn't become overly agitated, and I went upstairs to my bedroom, where I slept on the bed, opened my laptop on my stomach, and rested my head on a pillow to check if anyone was online. Apparently, someone Christmas-messaged me, "Hey, you okay, am I?" when someone else was bored and saw my name appear. "Yeah, I'm bored. Are your parents still away?" he asked, requesting a few more. I said, "Why don't I come around?" Chris said, "I don't want to be rude." Although I replied, "I see what you mean, and it's cool, but I kind of can't be bothered to hang out tonight, lel. What about tomorrow?" He suggested that, and I said, "That sounds better, cool. I'll be Chris. I told you that I had some family business to attend to in the morning at around 1. "All right," I said. "Do you still have a tent? If so, we could camp in the Inquired at a sleepover. I love you too, bro." And I mocked him about the garden or something. Chris said, "Yeah, some were letting me. But whatever, lel, you got the tent," I said. "Check, be right back." I got out of bed and went to look in the cupboard beneath the stairs, but I had no idea where the tent was. But I opened the cabinet door because it looked like a decent place to start. He began moving coats away because there were some cardboard boxes stacked at the back that might conceal it. I removed a few of the easily accessible ones after unstacking them, and I was lucky to have the tent bag enter. I grabbed the bag and the large garden umbrella that was next to it by leaning over the other boxes. I stopped and put the tent down in case it rained tomorrow. It took me a few moments to return to the window in the kitchen and concentrate on the darkness outside because my eyes weren't yet. I turned off the kitchen light and leaned on the back fence, adjusting to the darkness so I couldn't see all the way there. Counter and kept gazing at the same spot while the other garden objects gradually disappeared from vision. I wasn't sure what I wanted to see, but it suited my earlier mental image. The familiar shapes I recognized emerged from the darkness. But eventually I was positive that a figure was still standing against the rear-yard fence, but it hadn't moved, and after 15 minutes of staring at it, I was unable to determine its shape appropriately, but appeared as though someone was standing there. So I determined it wasn't a threat and wondered if I was in any actual danger. I would have been much more anxious by now, but that notion helped me stay composed. However, I also wanted to know what it was since I couldn't stand there indefinitely. I grabbed my laptop, rushed upstairs, and brought it down to the desk with me, and I said, "Could you come around now?" Chris said, "Yeah, I guess I can see something in my garden," so I told him it was an animal. I said, "I thought it was an umbrella, but now you're certain it's tall." "I don't know, I believed it was someone, but now I'm positive it was Chris who was questioned." When he questioned, I said, "I don't think it was there before, but it's not a person, it simply looks strange." "Perhaps I forgot to acknowledge earlier today," but Chris inquired, "Are you scared?" I replied that I would feel better if someone else was around, and I did offer to come over, and Chris remarked, "I'm bored." So I answered, "Yeah, I'll come soon." He said, "That's cool." I said, "Thanks, use the front gate." I then sat there and observed the black shape leaning. After 10 more minutes of pushing against the fence, the doorbell rang, and Chris rushed in, giving me a huge hug. "It's been too long," Chris said, feigning tears. I said, smiling, "It must have been a whole day." "The torment," he said. "Look, come over here," I urged, pushing him away and moving on while feigning to ignore me. I turned off the light in the kitchen and gestured toward the person. Chris said, "Look, give me a second," because he couldn't see well. A minute later, he realized, yes, we both stood there for a long, partly staring at that black monster. He leaned over the counter, expecting it to be gone. It was just a large "let's watch TV." "Will you make sure you have a torch?" I asked if you had a plant, a piece of wood or something. He said, "No," and I said, "Well, we could see if we keep." He offered to turn on the kitchen light and slightly open the back door. After giving it some thought, I accepted, but he added that we stayed close to the house, put on our sneakers, and unlock the rear door to enter. Chris went behind me that evening, and I could feel the warm, heavy air on the terrace, stood very near the door, looking at the back fence, wondering if I should have just began talking as he hurried back inside the home while continuing to stare at the fence. I followed him and turned and saw that the figure had vanished. The light from the back entrance made it clear that the fence, and Chris asked, "Where is it?" The rest of the garden was exactly as it usually was. I attempted to persuade both of us that it was resting against the fence and had most likely fallen over into a bush or something, decided that we were too anxious to go and check after staring out for a few more seconds. I don't typically give in to my night terrors, but they were just now starting to make sense to me. "Would you be able to spend the night with me?" inquired Chris. Yeah, that didn't sound like he genuinely wanted to, and he maintained his gaze on the fence. After we entered and shut the door, he walked up to my room, pulled out a sleeping bag for Chris, and drew the curtains without glancing out into the garden once more. We spent a while talking about pointless topics. We slept for a few hours to distract ourselves from the garden, and when I woke up, I discovered Chris' sleeping bag. Chris replied that he was downstairs when I called out to him, so I put on a shirt and went to bed. "Sleep well?" I inquired. "Yes, quite well, but I couldn't stop thinking about the garden and other things." "Hey, did you locate that tent?" when he came back, replied, recalling the shape that I had completely forgotten about, but I was also considering going camping. I considered bringing the tent to my place. It might simply help. You knew I didn't need to ask him why. After waiting all night, I wasn't very interested in staying in my garden. Upon reflection, I wanted to inspect the garden while it wasn't completely dark, so I asked Chris, and he reluctantly accepted, and after donning our sneakers, we entered the garden. I'm not sure why we were so concerned, but the bushes and plants surrounding the margins of the we walked to a place where the garden smelled nice and a bird was calling for its spouse from one of the small trees. The back fence examined the plants in front of the paneling to make sure nothing was amiss, and I circled the entire garden again, looking for anything behind them, but we couldn't find anything. Chris tried. It was a warm day, ideal for whistling, and it tilted its head side to side in an attempt to identify him. I made the decision to speak with you as we were camping that night, packing a few rucksacks with sleeping bags, and we packed some canned hot dogs, bread, and a package of food from the kitchen because we didn't want to start a fire. There is a forest just next to my house, and I have some water bottles, chocolate, and tomatoes. Chris explained that our garden backs against the side of the house, which is actually fairly good, and I stayed in a tent there. I remember being ecstatic when I went camping for the first time with my dad when I was around 7 years old. Chris smiled at himself if he believed we were acting like some extreme mountaineers. My parents are out, so we'll have free reign at my house if it becomes too cold or we need extra food. In any case, yours are also away. I asked if it's because it's their anniversary. He clarified that they would be spending the night at a motel and returning to the next town over. This summer, it seemed to be trendy to leave your children behind. At around midday, we departed from my house with the two of them. We packed the tent, a sleeping bag for each of us, and headed to Chris's. It was located in the same pleasant area as ours and was somewhat nearby. As we walked side by side, waving and greeting a few known neighbors, we spoke and joked a lot. It was an incredibly pleasant day, but the heat was nearly unbearable, making our necks hot, and as the sunshine filtered through the leaves of the sprinkler, the trees by the sidewalk appeared to glow green from underneath. Offered us some water as we passed a house, and it was pleasant on my warm arms. By this point, I was perspiring. After more than 20 minutes of walking, we arrived at Chris's residence, but we didn't enter his house right away. He wasn't kidding when he said that we went directly to his garden and dropped our things in the shade because it was so hot. His garden's gate faced directly into a magnificent forest, with towering, slender trees towering over the house, and as far as I could tell, the forest floor was mostly made up of grass or shrubs, but there were a few bushes and shrubs scattered throughout. I couldn't see how this forest was categorized because of the relatively smooth patches of soil. He boasted. "Small looks wonderful, right?" I acknowledged. I opened the gate and I strolled out between the trees to inspect the space, and when I located a level place for the tent, I turned around and asked. Chris found it disappointing that it didn't feel like true camping because his house was so clearly. I said and walked. "Let's go a little further and so it at least feels legit." But Chris refused to carry his hefty load any farther when I went back to retrieve my baggage. We left Chris's house in a straight manner and continued to look behind us until the house was only around. We had only ventured a very small distance in before being blocked by trees in front of one another. Yet there was also a long rope swing dangling from one of the trees, but the forest was already greener and thicker. Appeared too old to support our weight, so we made the decision to remain strong and give it a go. I unpacked the tent and Chris helped us set it up, and when we tossed our sleeping bags inside, I lay down to test it out. It was incredibly warm and humid. I had to take a moment to adjust my breathing. I went outside once more and asked Chris if he had a torch for the night. He replied, "I can do better than that," and fled for the house. I was too hot to chase after him. I took a bottle of water out of my rucksack, drank half of it, and then put the other portion back in the pack. I reclined on a grassy spot and gazed up at the canopy, where the leaves were softly moving in a breeze that I couldn't feel from below. And I saw them swaying and blending until I heard Chris. I asked, closing my eyes, "Did you get a torch?" As the sun shone through my eye, I listened to the gentle sound of his footfall on the grass as he passed, and it reddened my eyes. As I heard him pull the branch with a tiny creak, I warned him to move toward the rope swing that wouldn't support him. I listened as he pulled it again, and it creaked in response. There was stillness for a second time, as I assumed he was still considering it, and then he pulled again. I was certain it couldn't support his weight after a few more times, and each time there was a creaking sound, and I grinned, anticipating that there would be a large creak, and that the rope or branch would break. I waited as some last-minute tugs were created a watercourse, and waited for it to remain still. I sat bolt as I heard Chris's voice coming from his garden. He was jogging through the trees when I twisted my head sideways to face his house, nearly spraining my neck. With an electric lantern in hand, I looked away and toward the rope swing, which was hanging motionless with nothing close by. I got up and made a full circle with nothing in sight. I mouthed something to myself as I walked in the opposite direction and pulled on the rope. I pulled it harder, but it didn't crack gently, and my mouth dried up. I leaped to my feet, grabbed hold, and tugged it down the branch while bending slightly. I held onto it when I touched the floor, and it continued to make no sound. Looked up at the branches, but somewhere in the center, the rope finally buckled under my weight. Chris was rattling the light as he passed by, and I heard a gentle thud as the thick rope landed in front of me. I've never used this before, but my cousin gave it to me for Christmas. She buys some strange things. The swing is dead. Let's conduct a dignified funeral in honor of all the happiness it brought us. I didn't reply. Instead, I kept searching. "Chris, are you okay?" I followed my instructions at the branch with a half-rope swing attached. "I thought you had returned by now, so I said right away that I wasn't the kind," he said. "Oh, it's nothing," and let things go. Someone walked by me and was playing with the rope swing. I'm not sure who it was. I was lying there with my eyes closed, so I'm not sure if they are still there. I pointed, but then I heard you yell, so I turned to look around, but I couldn't find anything. I could hear them pass by my head, a little queasy. "Please settle down for a moment," Chris started. "It's midday, and we're 30 feet from my house, and even if someone were to enter, it wouldn't matter because it's just a public woods." He was correct that it was public, and it made some sense, but where were they? I took another look around, but the woods soon grew too dense for me to see very far. I assumed it's probable that I'll lose sight of someone here in a short while, but I said, "Men, I can stay. I can spend weeks by myself in the house." But I couldn't stand a quick summertime stroll in the woods, which is why Chris said, "You've brought some muscle," as he raised the light above his head, and I chuckled. We spent the day together. When we got too hot while strolling in the forest and going back to the tent to grab some water, we discussed school, and we discussed our future ambitions and our experiences with ghosts and nightmares. Creatures that hid in the shadows. None of us was particularly afraid of them, but they served a useful purpose. Chris shared some great stories about camping, one of which was about a woman who lived in the woods. She had a cat's head, and her raspy meow indicated that she was looking for you if she stopped. The meowing signaled that you had been located, and she was rapidly approaching you, which made my skin itch a little. Soon after, we stopped sharing stories, and slowly the daylight dimmed, and it was becoming difficult to see, so we returned to the tent for the night. The day's intense heat had ruined our appetites, so we decided to put off eating the food for the time being and eat it at night if we were hungry. Chris hung the azzy feet flicked on the electric lantern at the front of the tent. It was unexpectedly bright and spilled a yellow light. The warm glow was dramatic as light spilled onto the ground and the trees facing us, but whatever was beyond our immediate surroundings were clear. But after a few steps, the light appeared to go out completely. Chris ducked into the tent entrance, and I followed him because it looked strange. The sleeping bags were tempting, and the heat from it was too chilly for shirts and shorts, so we went inside and took "Can you hear me because we have a candle with us," I said, tilting my head as Chris grinned and zipped up, and I could hear some too. I thought I had him, but I zipped up my own sack and forgot about his sleeping bag. We lay there chatting for a little time before we passed out from the heat of the summer. I had a dream that we were once more making our way to Chris's house, but this time there were more trees, and it got dark very fast, and when I blinked, it was night and the forest was spreading out. The rope swung in front of me in all directions. I turned around, and Chris was gone. I heard a creak behind me, and I had the impression that I had missed it for some reason. I was unable to turn around and began to walk after stepping onto the stairs. Straight forward, and the rope swing quickly returned to my field of vision. I knew I was having a bad dream when the rope swung slowly as I saw it ascend into the trees and vanish. I went over and stood where it had been, and when I raised my gaze to the canopy, I heard a rustle above me. A black figure with a cat's head sprang down with its jaws gaping horribly, one tooth bared. Touched my left eye, causing me to gasp and sit up in the tent. Chris was sleeping beside me. My back was sweating, the lantern was still on, and I could see our backpacks. I paused to catch my breath at the end of the tent before letting myself drop back down, my head beating on the ground. A bit too forcefully, I flinched and grabbed the water bottle by my side. The lantern's shine on my eyelids prevented me from falling asleep after a few mouthfuls. Thus, as soon as I sat up and looked around the tent, I saw that the light was coming from outside. I spoke to Chris, still dazed from sleep, and he muttered something back. "Where's the lantern?" he asked softly. "Somewhere, drowsily, before flipping over and examining the area once more. The light was clearly I considered my alternatives after seeing it from the outside. Either a killer had snuck in, either we didn't truly bring the lantern inside our tent and simply took it outside, or I knelt before the tent because I had misremembered that it sounded more plausible. I opened the door, unzipped it, and glanced around. But it wasn't right away. It was clear where the illumination was coming from, so I peered up the 20 feet above the ground. A lantern hung in the darkness, sending goosebumps flying across my skin, and I quickly closed the door before yelling, "Please wake up, Chris." He sat up when he heard how urgent I was speaking. "What's wrong, Chris?" he asked. He rubbed his eyes and said, "I brought it in, but the lanterns are hanging outside." When my logic failed, I felt ill, and we both glanced at the front of I murmured, my resolve faltering, "Tent, we should return to the house." I'm not going through the dark," he said. "A child in a jungle with his parents away." Chris responded, "We have a lantern." I stopped myself, and we gazed at the front of the tent once more, but we were too afraid to remain there indefinitely. We decided that instead of going back to sleep, we would retrieve the lantern as we sat there doing nothing. I detested having to leave everything here and spend the night at Chris's house. I wanted to turn around, even if it was simply to squat by the tent entrance as I was the first to leave. Unzipping the cloth entrance, I glanced over the tent and saw nothing. There was absolutely nothing behind us. It was dark outside the light when I stepped outdoors, and Chris confirmed that it was chilly. "Oh my God," when he stood directly next to me, glancing over his shoulder. He whirled around and saw the lantern in the air. I stood there staring at it for a few seconds, and after a while, I figured out which tree it was suspended from the splintered rope swing at my feet. And it was proved to be high up out of reach, the lantern that was attached to the opposite end of the rope that was still hanging from the darkness above our heads. Couldn't figure it out because the trees were too high up for even a ladder. There was nowhere to climb to pick up the length of rope that was thin and barren aside from the leaves that formed the canopy. Had already broken off, so I wrapped it up, nodded it, and pointed it toward the lantern before stepping back and leaping, hurling it. It swung the lantern through the air after catching it on its side. The light caused the shadows to sway from side to side around us, and I instantly wished it hadn't struck. I grew alarmed by the lantern's terrible, unnatural swaying, and my eyes became wet as panic gripped me tightly. I grabbed the rope once more and frantically threw it at the lantern I had missed. As the bundle of rope disappeared into the night, I looked to Chris, who has already snatched up his rucksack, thrown it with a yelp, and it struck the lantern dead on, causing it to fall and thud with a crack to the floor, although I nearly sobbed as I turned to face Chris while the light was still on and rushed to pick it up. With relief, I said, "Okay, let's go," and he began briskly jogging in the direction of his we partly raced. Half stumbled into the dark as I followed the home to check on our shoulders and exerting ourselves as our minds were preoccupied. All that might be in store in the I'm not sure how long we were moving. But it quickly became clear that Chris's, for heaven's sake, whereas the house that wasn't in this direction. Chris's voice became tense as he stated, "We'll need to locate the tent and try again." A few tears were starting to well up in the corners of his eyes, likely on mine as well, but I was too distracted by my heart's pounding to notice. "All right," I took a breath, and we turned around and headed straight behind us. I couldn't stop myself if we didn't discover the tent, believing it repeatedly when we went back. We had traveled for what felt like twice as long before when the tent site eventually lit up, we rushed up and stood near it, scanning the area to try to find out, unsure of which way to proceed. The silence felt like a nightmare building before some terrible. The analogy made me gag, and I scrunched my eyes shut as the hair on my skin lifted as the creature lurches out at you screaming. I couldn't even begin to fathom where my brain was thudding against the interior of my skull since my temples were so heated. The house was roughly 10 feet away from the lantern before it became completely dark. Every direction appeared incorrect, and Chris snatched the lantern away from me. Striving to check if I remained in place, he walked in a little circle, shut it off. I quickly murmured to him what he asked, walked swiftly and gently. I brought my face to his, and he looked past me towards something in the tent. We stood on the left side of the tent, and from this vantage point, I could see him standing there, staring. I remembered leaving the zipper door hanging open, but I could hardly see it. That wasn't the reason I was gritting my teeth several feet away from my knapsack. The food I had prepared was now neatly organized in a sack that stood outside on the dry earth, and our sleep in. Additionally, the bags were neatly arranged from end to end, allowing the line of possessions to lead directly into the tent's mouth. Moved forward cautiously to let the light to flow through the fabric more easily. This couldn't have been a trick of the dark, large object was clearly crouching with what I assumed to be its front toward the open door. I felt guilty for not noticing it sooner because it didn't move or appear to breathe. Simply waited for us to examine the display before turning it off. Muttered once more, "Chris, you're still staring at me, deaf," I begged. Chris and I both heard a voice from nearby join in as blood spilled in. Our veins were filled with the sound of a sluggish, strained voice coming from the tent. The sound crawled across my skin like a parrot copying a new word. With a click that was too loud, the light went off into my ears, and Chris seized. I gripped my fists painfully hard around my shoulder as we stood there in total darkness, and I didn't want to remain in my head or move. As my legs awaited a decision firmly established, we inhaled and struggled for control, blackness pushing on our eyes like water, shallow, silent breathing, and perspiration streaming down my. Something hissed. Chris and I couldn't see the tent, which made my stomach turn. I instantly grabbed Chris's hand and yanked him in the face while the object in the tent messed with my words. Chris's legs thudded alternatively while I ran in the opposite way, something I had never done before. We lost ourselves while running for around a minute while the sprint went on with mine. In complete darkness, I lost sight of our location and was unable to see what was in front of me. I collided with a tree and my forehead made a dreadful hollow knocking sound against its side. Spark attempted to drag me on as I swallowed back the pain in my eyes, but I was unable to breathe. My brain went numb as I fell onto my back, spewed up, and crumpled to the floor on my knees. Chris helped me up, but he pleaded with me to stop, but I was unable to respond. Please, continue. My legs to support my weight while I leaned on Chris's body and locked my knees up. Felt empty, and a small amount of blood trickled onto my brow and down my forehead. I wiped it away while attempting to understand the happened once more, but the agony was too much, so I pleaded we stood together in the pitch black woods. Although we could have been, Chris was snuggled next to me, but I couldn't see him anywhere. It was like someone had covered my head with a blanket. We waited silently, but our breathing was noisy, and I pondered how far away it could be heard. But reality started to sink in, and the agony was now hardly tolerable. Straightened up and grasped what was occurring. Fear gripped me again, and I began to count in. There was no sound in the universe for a minute. The wind was dead, and I kept counting for 3 more minutes, but the birds could be too late. I grabbed Chris's arm in the air, but we were still alone. Was it even searching for us? Dark jumped as I touched it, but he was still holding the lantern well when I steadied him with the other hand. I reviewed the events. We had light on our side now, if only we could use it. I quickly imagined that the lantern was dangling from a tree. We exited the tent, but we were unable to locate our way home by something was in the tent when we got back. But why did it take the lantern and do nothing while we slept, and if we were lucky enough to be alone ourselves when attempting to retrieve the lantern? I wondered how little that there was a chance we may be given another chance, so I remained silent for a while before, as quietly as possible, "Chris," I said, "we must turn on the lantern. Leave now so that we can flee to your house, but we must." Chris tried to murmur. "See, no, we have to stay here. We can wait until." I could hear a sob in his voice. "This morning, if we have to turn it off," was about to emerge, so I parted my lips and said, "Just keep quiet. You have to please." To give it another go, but as I did, I heard a very slight clicking noise. It was nearly inaudible, coming from somewhere in the dark, but there was an unusual clicking sound that was stuttering, like fingernails on a wooden table, and with a constant click, clack. I knew it was moving and coming from ahead of us. As we attempted to determine the distance it was drawing, I heard a click. I was relieved for the first time in a long time when the closer click clicked and clack stopped. My existence that I was unable to see what lay beyond the darkness, which would indicate that we were also, as my mind raced in all directions. I gave the object in the shadows the appearance of the cat-headed woman, and I was frightened since I was only anticipating that meow. But my ears, Chris, when I heard anything else. I stiffened my throat and made an effort not to. "Chris." It repeated his name twice, and I started crying. The awful scraping conversation sound a few feet away as I covered my mouth with my palm. The remarks were spoken strangely and without any context. They were simply, Chris released my hand, and I heard noises that this monster had picked up and was now exploding to trap us in the dark. As he got ready to go, he heard his foot softly plant on the grass behind him. "Don't, Chris, don't you make a sound," I tried to project into his head. Chris let out a sound that sounded so strange, like a door slowly opening. I froze and waited for anything to happen as it called him with a whimper. I couldn't wait any longer, so I held my breath for as long as I could during the lengthy stillness. Chris and I gradually raised our feet after I slowly reached out and placed my hand on his shoulder. We were able to move away from the voice without producing any noise and continued to move, but very slowly and carefully. I didn't care how long it took. It would take us to get anywhere. If it took an hour, Chris backed against a tree with each step we were taking to exit. The clicking began right away, and the sound of gasping was audible. On continuously approaching us, I was at a loss for what to do. As we stood there listening to the clicking, I tried to keep my eyes closed and not scream. "Chris, please turn it on." It stopped an arm's length away from where we were standing. Assumed control, turned on the light, and sped off in the opposite way without turning around. I wheeled in seat and kept that lantern in front of me as if nothing else existed. We were afraid to look at it, yet we could hear our footsteps thumping on the grass, and the creature followed us like a little scurrying thing, tapping, tapping, and tapping. The sound abruptly arose behind me and over our hard earth as I frantically sprinted to catch up to the light. This was about to fall on us, heads in between the trees, and I screamed that I no longer cared. We had to flee for them if we were going to end our lives, but we abruptly reversed our direction. Before it moved toward us once more, the tapping paused long enough for us to move a few feet. My legs were gasping and heavily, and having terrible cramps, we couldn't continue. Where were we? Up ahead, I noticed the lantern's light abruptly stop. I thought it was time to halt and prepared to bump into Chris. But the light went by beneath me because he had dropped the lantern. I looked back and saw it disappear into the night, but it was already too far for me to turn around. The creature would be Chris. I was crying and blotting tears from my eyes in a moment, my cheeks as I sprinted in anticipation of my face colliding with a tree at any second. Continue. Chris called out to me from ahead. A light was visible, but my vision was blurry from weeping. Could make out another one in the distance, with an orange glow hanging in the air. I wanted to yell at him to stop what was happening, but I understood that it was with a goal in sight. I progressively pushed my legs harder, even though it felt like I was running through water in the street light. And agonizingly, the light and the clicking that allowed this object to move drew closer. Unbeknownst to me, I noticed Chris's silhouette move beneath the street light, and then he disappeared once more. "Don't stop," I cried as I got closer to the edge of the woodland, and as the forest floor gave way to firm ground, my legs adapted. Could see Chris's figure moving off and behind a row of additional streetlights that led off to the right. I continued running beneath a number of additional street lights, even after I was certain I had left the trees entirely. After a while, I understood that the clicking was as far away from us as I could keep, and the edge of the woods had paused. I needed to make sure we were all right, so I turned to look behind me. My pace slowed as I kept my eyes on the first light in the row of lights. My head and legs started hurting again, and then there was silence again, and the lights came on, showed a deserted path, which I jogged along while keeping my eyes on the glow in anticipation to see something at any time, but it only illuminated the road's border and the concrete. As I turned to face them, the question kept repeating in my head. As I was catching up to Chris, I noticed something go by beneath the first street light. A tremendous jolt went through me, and after my worries were validated, I cried out and accelerated again, running between the lights. I barely saw the object since it was so ingrained in my memory, but it was huge and white, nearly brushing the street lamp as it passed beneath it. Its tall, erect body was full of, I could only make out the impression that kinks had just unfolded itself. I didn't have time to look, but it must have had a face and limbs. More lights appeared along the route once more, and soon I could see the windows glowing. By some miracle, I was able to identify the houses on either side of the road that were close to my house, and we would be at my house. I would shout, and Chris would hear me as I turned left onto a side street. And as I hurried down in terror, I came to a bend, and as I heard Chris yell as he approached the fence, I turned to see him leaping over it into my garden. My ankle ached as I thudded after placing my hands on top to lift myself over and tearing my elbows in the process. Chris stepped aside, panting, and I fumbled the key into kitchen door as I ran into the garden. We both flew into the kitchen and slammed the door after I locked it from the side and wrenched it inside, and we both ran upstairs to the restroom, shutting it after ourselves. "Did you notice Chris crouching?" What was it that I managed to mumble in a terrified whisper, wondering whether it would get in? I couldn't stop crying beneath the window because it was so tall. As we sat there, I repeatedly mulled it over, so don't tell me Chris interrupted me. Hours passed slowly, and my head was racing the entire time, and I could still hear that repulsive voice coming from my forearms and elbows. were covered in blood, and we both gazed at the ground as our hearts occasionally ached, pounded in our chests, and we slept with the light coming in from the glass. But it wasn't until noon that we crept downstairs and unlocked the bathroom door. The kitchen door was still. I peered out the living room window on another lovely day when the house was locked and nobody was home. However, I could hear birds again and the sprinklers were on, which helped to ease our anxiety. "The tent can stay there," I replied. Chris finally consented, and we spent the entire day in the living room without the TV on. The day passed slowly as we attempted to figure out what to do and discussed whether to call the police or something else, to discuss our ideas and decide what to do next. But all I could think about was what had just by the time it got dark at around 9:00 p.m., it was not what we were supposed to be doing. When Chris's phone rang, it was parents were frightened and wanted to know whether I had seen him. I told them that he had just returned from an out-of-town trip, was all right, and requested that they come get us both from my residence because they had experienced anything, wanted to know what. But I told them we would both let them know when they arrived. They responded that they would arrive shortly, and a wave of relief passed. We adults were trying to put things right, and they would trust us if we told them the truth about these things. If they were doubtful, they would at least think that the presence of a deadly animal in the forest was sufficient. I realized I hadn't had a drink all day when I walked into the kitchen to get some juice from the refrigerator for us. I turned the faucet tighter and drank some juice as I made my way to the sink after hearing water dripping. When the water in the living room began to tap once more, I turned on the light and saw that it wasn't coming from the sink. It seemed like it was coming from farther away, or from anywhere in the room for that matter. I could barely make out a tall, fuzzy shape leaning against the back as I turned to face the garden. The tapping in the dark actually sounded more like clicking, and the creature proceeded slowly. "Please move away from the fence and click across the grass in the direction of the house."